Hi, I'm Josh Stanish. I'm here at the Federation of Fly Fishers in Livingston, Montana. And today we're going to be tying a little Baetis nymph. You can also make this into any kind of your mayfly nymphs that you want. It's called a wonder nymph. It comes actually from down on the Bighorn. Brad Downey is kind of the inventor of this fly. And there's a lot of flies that have come out recently that are real similar to it. One's called a batwing emerger. But I really fish this fly more so when there's a good hatch coming off and you're getting a lot of insects washed under. The wing on it really looks like a kind of a drowned mayfly. It does work well as just a nymph before a hatch or when there is no hatch activity, but I've found this fly most effective when I can get below a nice slick flat where there's a lot of mayflies hatching, and then you get into some fast riffles below it and you fish this underneath the surface and it works great. To start with, we're basically going to use a Tiemco 5212 hook here. Any kind of light wire, which is real important on this fly, a light wire dry fly or hopper hook. This is a 2X shank, so it's a little longer, but you really want the light wire. It'll help you immensely in getting this body material onto this hook. So what we're going to start with is we're going to put this hook into the vise actually upside down because we're going to slide some body material over the top. What I'm using here is just the standard tubing from Hairline and an olive color. And you can vary this up depending on what type of mayfly you're trying to imitate. I tie with a brown body, sometimes with a little kind of goldish yellow colored body. But the olive for the Baetis is typically the one I fish the most. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little piece of this tubing. You want it to be a little shorter than the length of your hook shank. And I like to trim a little angle off on it, on both ends here. And this is the tricky part. You come in and kind of guess your length. We're going to cut that off. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to slide this tubing up onto the hook. That's why we're going to use a light wire hook on here. You get a heavy wire hook and it's hard to slide this on, plus it won't really compress the tubing to give you the ribbed effect on it. So what we're going to do is just take and wet this tubing a little bit. Helps it slide on the hook. And we're going to slide this tubing right over the point, which just takes a little practice, and sometimes you'll drop them, so you may want to cut a bunch of bodies first. So we'll slide this tubing on right over the hook, then take your fingernail and just encourage it to go right around the bend of that hook. Once you get it on around the bend, you slide it on up onto the shank of the hook, and this is going to give us the body color. Another reason you want to use a light wire hook is because you got to attach a tail here. Now this fly, it's very important. I'm going to slide this tubing up over the eye a little bit. It's very important with this fly that you take your thread and you make as fewer wraps as possible because you don't want to get a whole bunch of bulk on here. It'll kill you. So we're going to attach our thread right at the rear. We're going to make 2 or 3 wraps forward and then wrap right back to the rear in our starting point. We'll trim that off and then we're going to attach our tail. For the tail, I'm just taking a hen neck here, and I'm going to pull off one of the big fibers. This is a kind of a darker dun colored. We're going to take one of these big pieces, and we're just going to strip back some of our fibers, and we'll come in and pinch them and pull them back against the grain of that hackle, and that'll keep all those tips nice and even so that we can get a nice little tail here. Now you're going to take your tail. You want that tail to be about the same length as the hook shank. We're going to move it back. Use our little pinch method here. Pinch our thread and secure that with a few wraps right on top. Get it right back to the rear. And we'll come in and try and trim these extra fibers off as close as possible. Now we're going to take our tubing and slide this tubing back up onto the shank of the hook. And the reason you do a little angle cut is that'll help to pin your tail fibers back a little bit. So you're going to slide that tubing back. Now we're going to take our thread and start wrapping right over this tubing. And what this is going to do is pinch that tubing a little bit and give us a little bit of a segmented look on that body. So now we've got our basic part of our body made, and that tubing is a really nice looking body. And the key to it is using very few wraps of thread. So once we have our body made, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to put in the actual wonder wing. What I use for the wonder wing is I use these real inexpensive, cheap or hackles. Actually comes from mewing featherbirds. The key to this wonder wing is you want to find a hackle that has very small stems on it, which can be hard to do. Anymore, these stems are getting a little bigger and a little tougher to find the right small stem on here, because if you get a real fat one, it's going to be brittle. You get the smaller stems, they tend to be less brittle. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come in, we're just going to use the very bottom end of this hackle. So you have to find one that's going to be about the right size. You peel it off, and all we're going to end up using is just this real fluffy part down towards the bottom. That's going to be a little small, so I'm going to go ahead and move further up the neck here and find one that's got a little more width to it. That one's not very good either. There we go. There we go. So we're going to end up using just this very bottom end of the stem, but like I was saying, you really want to try and find some hackle that has a fairly narrow stem on it. That's going to make it so when you stretch this over, it's less brittle. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to trim it off basically right where the fluffy stuff starts here. Then we're going to come in. I'm going to get rid of this very bottom end of it so that I have something to tie down. So you prep that, and you come in with your scissors on both sides of the here, and you're going to trim this down till you have what you think is going to be the distance you're going to pull it over. So a little bit shorter here. Get that trimmed out on that side, and you come over and do the same thing on the other side. And try and get it even there. Now what we're going to do, just wet your fingers a little bit, pull back on that fluffy material, and then you can bring it right in here, and we're going to bring our thread back to just about the midway point of the hook is where I like to tie this wing in. And we're just going to tie it in, and you want to tie it right where those fluffy fibers are, right at the edge of your thread. You get that tied in right on top. Go ahead and make some good wraps to secure that down. Trim off our little tag end here. Get that covered up. Now we're going to come in. And for the Baetis nymph, I like to use this hairline dubbing. It's number 29. It's their olive dun color, but this seems to be a very good color. It's one that I use for the Baetis most of the time. We're just going to get a little bit of dubbing here. And we're just going to take very small amounts of dubbing, because with dubbing, you always can add dubbing to it, but it's real hard to take it away. So you want to use real small amounts. And we're just going to cover up this thread here. Get a few, probably about 3 little clumps of it here. A little too much there. Get that tied on. Like I said, we can always come in and add more, so don't overdo it. I like to start with my dubbing right up by the eye, leaving room for my head. I'll work my way back to where we secured that in place, and then come back towards the front. Don't have quite enough dubbing, so I'm just going to add a little more here. And I like to keep this fly fairly slender. I don't like to make it a big fat nymph. I'm usually fishing it on tailwaters and spring creeks, so I like to keep it fairly small. So we get our thorax built in here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this little wing right here that we have, and we're going to fold it straight over the top. Come right to the front. Measure it up. If you have a few extra fibers that are sticking beyond your eye, go ahead and reach in there. Pull those back against that stem, and you can get those out of the way. If you have a bunch of extra sticking up there and you tie over it, it tends to want to crush this a little bit. So I'm going to hold that in place. Take a loose wrap right over the top. Another loose wrap. And pull this stem up to try and pull it in a little bit. And then I stick it up just like that. Pull my wing back out of the way. Get a couple more wraps and trim that tag end off. And then we can go ahead and put a nice little whip finish for a head on the front here. Trim off our thread. Then you got this nice little bushy wing that's on here. And when this gets wet, this wing really kind of flows in the water. It really looks kind of like a drowned mayfly. It does work really well as just a nymph to fish, but I've had my best days with it, fishing it when there's a really big hatch and getting in a riffle below and fishing it underneath the surface, just under an indicator or even trailing off the back of a dry fly. It's a great little fly. If you're into technical fishing, this is a great one for those guys who are into the techie stuff, but it also works real well in a lot of the freestone. So get out and give it a shot.